Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good morning, Team Krulak community, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Brewcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. As always, all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of any institution with which they may be otherwise affiliated. So this week, the Krulak Center is hosting a writing workshop focusing on NATO's northern flank and Arctic security concerns, coordinated by Dr. Njord Wegge of the Norwegian Defence University College, who is in residence with us here at Marine Corps University as the chair for Arctic security. He was kind enough to arrange some broadcast opportunities with the workshop contributors, and today is our second one featuring a panel discussion on Arctic security and great power competition. The panel will be moderated by Dr. Yuval Weber, our Russia subject matter expert, and I'll turn it over to him for introductions and opening comments.
Thank you all for your participation. Thank you all for your attention, and welcome all. So obviously this is going to be a wonderful panel, and I'll jump right into introductions in just 1 second. But just to note the overall context, we feel that in the context of this Russia-Ukraine war, we're about to get the contours of the rest of the 21st century in terms of how this war ends up. Because in addition to the security issues that we're about to learn about, there's also the grander context of climate change, but also Russia's participation in the Arctic. Russia has long held that its position as having the most amount of economic activity in the region, as well as the most amount of people, have made it, in essence, one of the leading powers of the Arctic. But as we'll see, the sanctions regime has limited what energy and mining concerns can do in the region. The mobilization and the massive loss of war is going to impact what amount of labor is available for Russia in this region. And of course, the mobilization has hit ethnic and indigenous communities in the Arctic most of all. So that's just, the part from Russia, but we're about to learn a lot more about what are the other security concerns of the region. So I will now introduce the rest of the panelists in the order that they were listed, and then I would ask each of them to give an open introductory statement of no more than 5 minutes so that we have enough time for common discussion as well as questions. So first we will have, and I apologize for any Scandinavian mispronunciations, we have Liselotte Odgaard, who is coming from the Norwegian Institute of Defence Studies as a professor. And in the interest of time, I won't go over everyone's very impressive resumes. Second, we have Stian Bones, who's coming from the Arctic University of Norway in the Department of Archaeology, History, Religious Studies, and Theology. Third is our very own Lon Strauss, who is an assistant professor of military history and war studies at the Command and Staff College of Marine Corps University. Fourth is Steinar Torset, who's coming from the Norwegian Defence Command and Staff College, and he is the head of section there. And then last but certainly not least, our very own, or half of our very own, Njord Wegge, whose main position is at the Norwegian Military Academy and as a professor. So without any further ado, please, Dr. Odgaard.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this occasion. I would start by pointing out that even if Russia appears to be down and out and struggling as a result of its invasion of the Ukraine, I don't think it has lost interest in, or at least in the long-term ability to bump up its engagement in the Arctic. In some ways, it's become even more important for Russia. It may take a decade or two for it to recuperate and rebuild itself and be able to build up the Arctic as it plans to do according to its strategy. But I think it will look to China to do this. And so when we look at Russian-Chinese cooperation, a lot of researchers focus on the question if China would become a military power in the Arctic. I think that's really sort of diverting the discussion because the Arctic is not a main priority for China. And although it has investments all over the Arctic as a global power, it doesn't have much interest in building up a significant military presence in the Arctic. However, it does have an interest in helping Russia to be able to pose strategic dilemmas for NATO and ensure that Russia can sort of be able to bother NATO militarily so that the Western allies has strategic dilemmas in both being kept busy along China's border in the Indo-Pacific and with Russia in Europe. So in that sense, I think this cooperation is important to follow. And what is going on is that Russia wants to digitalize the Northern Sea route, which is already a sort of Russian internal waterway, even if it needs to build up the ports along that waterway to profit from the economic potential that the sea route has as the sea ice melts. The sea ice isn't going to melt in the near future, but it's useful for redirecting Russian oil and gas exports to China, and it can bypass Western states in those exports. And so China is already helping Russia building railways and ports so that they don't have to pass through Western countries such as South Korea, which they do now. And they're also building roads over land. China has the sort of digital solutions to integrate sea freight and land freight that Russia is missing. And Russia is already putting fiber optic cable on the bottom of the sea along the Northern Sea route. So this process of digitalization is already underway. China is offering to build out the ports. Ideally, they would like to have their own replenishment and repair facilities in those ports, because if they had that, they could operate independently. But China understands that Russia wants to maintain control over the Northern Sea route, and therefore it's going to hold back on sort of demanding that it can operate independently, because again, this is not, China doesn't look to dominate the area. It wants Russia to keep on dominating it. That's much more efficient for China, and it can do that under the radar, so it doesn't get criticized in an area that is sort of low on their list of priorities. A thing to look particularly at, I think, is Chinese-Russian plans for sharing ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. This is really an area where they can cooperate, and which would allow Russia to bother NATO a lot more. So for Russia, as there is more traffic along the Northern Sea route, of course, they're worried about their strategic nuclear submarines capability on the Kola Peninsula. They want to protect it, and they have built more than 475 facilities to that end since 2014. They also wanted to have continued access to the Atlantic. China has investments all over the Arctic, and if they share data with Russia, they can help Russia get increased situational awareness. There is also the possibility that they could integrate their satellite navigation systems, and that can help them complicate NATO power projection through coordinated GPS disruption operations. The question is, how much do these two trust each other? And that will then determine how much they will share. So this is essentially the puzzle that I think needs to be focused on. Joint reconnaissance capabilities between the two would refine Moscow's ability to use precision-guided missiles against NATO's defense infrastructure. So in the area of ISR, there's a lot of possibilities for cooperation between the two that will allow Russia to be able to bother NATO and the Northern Sea route, diverting oil and gas towards China, which is happy to buy these resources, is also something China would be happy to help Russia do. And so these sort of trends are ongoing, and they haven't been stopped by the Ukraine war. They may be delayed, but they're not stopping. And so I think we need to think in terms of 1 or 2 decades. And then I think we will see that the Arctic is going to be remain a sort of rising tension area. And so my recommendation would be for NATO to continue, or NATO countries to continue to work on how they can deliver pushback against Russia in this region long term.
Great, thank you, Dr. Odgaard. And your comments reminded me of one of the famous phrases of Russian diplomacy. After Russia had lost the Crimean War in the mid-19th century, its foreign minister, Prince Gorshakov, had said Russia had taken a break from international politics. And he said, Russia is not sulking, she is merely taking a breather, which suggests that at maybe a decade or 2 after this particular war, we will see a more resurgent Russia, in effect, coming back to active international participation in this region and others. So thank you very much, Dr. Odgaard. For our next speaker, let us go to Dr. Bones. Dr. Bones, please, floor is yours. Let's speak for about 5-6 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us and for hosting this event. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm a historian, and so my perspective will take an historical account of the discussion here. But perhaps also I'll comment on some ongoing processes also. There is, of course, there is a great concern in Scandinavia as of today on what the consequences will be with the China rise and more power projection in East Asia and in the Pacific. What will that mean for NATO's northern flank? I think that is very important to bear in mind, that we have to discuss this. And I'm sure Norwegian politicians are keenly aware of that matter. However, there are a couple of lines here that I think we should bear in mind. It is a historical fact that the United States has, and the fact that the United States is an Arctic country in itself. It is protecting the Western Hemisphere. That includes Greenland, and it's been so for more than 100 years. So the United States has very important self-interests in the Arctic, and will continue to have that, no matter what happens elsewhere. We, as Norwegians and Danes, we can sometimes find that both reassuring and troubling, but that's the case. And as for Norway, Norway has kind of been dominated by Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. So that has kind of been the permanent security environment around Norway. And these powers have been setting the sea. And I do not, I follow up on that. I do not believe that the changes there will be, there will not be these powers will continue to be the most, especially Russia and the United States, influential in the Arctic. It has to do with geography, economic interests, and power, the ability for power projection, as well as other things also. I also believe that the Chinese factor here has much to do with the connection with Russia, and we don't really know too much about how that will play out. I think also that there are some traditions here that I think will continue also with regards to the Nordic countries and the question of Finland and Sweden joining NATO, which will, I'm sure, will happen soon. Before the Atlantic Pact was signed in 1949, there were broad discussions between Norway and Denmark and Sweden about forming a Scandinavian pact, which eventually it became NATO instead, and Sweden remained neutral. But throughout the Cold War, there was kind of cooperation going on beneath these official alignments. So during the Cold War, Norwegian politicians liked to talk about the Nordic balance, and there was a kind of a understanding between the Nordic countries about how to deal with security policies. Although Sweden didn't join NATO, and Finland was not part of NATO either. And I believe that such sentiments that has dominated the Scandinavian and Nordic politics for decades still will be a part of the political discussions, even under very changed security conditions that are now. So I believe when Sweden and Finland are joining NATO, they will kind of perform as they will look to Denmark and Norway and see how they have played out their policies towards Russia, especially on the northern flank, and I think they will adjust to that. So there will be some elements of self-imposed restrictions, or what you would like to call them, I think, also for Sweden and Finland. So I don't think they will perform or have a kind of a similar policies as the Baltic states or Poland. That's they will have another posture here. I believe that. Also, the third, if I have time, short comment on Norway and Russia. You know, throughout the Cold War, there were some where Norway and the Soviet Union could find common ground for cooperations. For instance, with regards to fisheries cooperation in the sensitive Barents Sea area, they were able to do that, and this cooperation is still going on. And I think that eventually, after some years, it will be natural for Norway to try and fall back on that position again. There is no signs now, I think, if you study what Oslo is doing with regards to Russia, to changing that course, really. So I think that although Norway will have very much attention towards renewing and getting a more updated deterrence, which is naturally, of course, we will eventually try and find some common ground also to try and keep sort of tensions not to rise too much in the Barents Sea and the northeast of that. That's my impression. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Bones. So moving on, we have Marine Corps University's very own Lon Strauss. Please, Lon, go ahead, and we'll keep it to, you know, a tight 5 to 6. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yuval, I really appreciate, again, this opportunity, the same as everyone else. I am a military historian at the Command and Staff College, the Marine Corps Command and Staff College here. And my interest, or the reasoning for my participation in this project, is really stems from the Marine Corps shift with the concept of expeditionary advanced-based operations and the Force Design 2030 the Commandant put out. But also in regards on a larger level to where that fits in with our other services concepts, is kind of the direction we're going, and what this means for the Arctic or NATO's northern flank. So I'm working with Dr. Wegge on this project, and the two of us are kind of combining our efforts on this. So I'll take up a piece of this, and then I'll leave it for him to talk in a broader context with some of the other issues that we're going to be discussing. But I think on the one hand, we have, say, the Marine Corps specifically as a service shifting its focus. And there is a big debate both in the Marine Corps and outside the Marine Corps over what that means. It's very much an Indo-Pacific focus, even though I think we, and I'll say we as the Marine Corps, talk out of both sides of our mouths in that we want this to be applicable everywhere. But at the same time, the real threat that it's focused on is really China. And I think the documents really bear that out, right? There's a focus on that. So in the scenario of, say, EABO, and where Force Design 2030 is driving the Marine Corps, because that is force structure and that is training, manning, and equipping, they're hoping, I guess the assumption, right? The assumption is that the Marine Corps will be an inside force or stand-in force, right? The inside force, that's multi-domain operations language, but a stand-in force in the Indo-Pacific. What about in a region where the Marines are not a stand-in force? And that would be in Scandinavia. Even with, say, Finland and Sweden joining NATO, we don't know what their policies are going to be, but we can certainly assume to a certain degree that they'll follow policies that they have been walking, you know, throughout the Cold War up to now. And Norway has certainly maintained, even as a founding NATO member. And that's not to house foreign militaries on their soil, not to have foreign basing on their soil, unless, again, there's an escalation to the point where they invite those folks in. So if we're talking about a scenario where, say, a general war with Russia were to break out, and I think this is where it's really important, as opposed to an isolated incident like we saw specifically with Ukraine, where we've seen NATO is able to kind of marshal forces, even though they're not getting involved specifically in the fight in Ukraine. They've been able to marshal forces to assist Ukraine. So what if that is spread out across NATO's front, across Eastern Europe and into, say, NATO's high north, and possibly, again, you know, we're talking NORTHCOM's north, so the Arctic, Alaska, Greenland, Canada, and so on. So now we're talking a general front where the Marine Corps and the Army, the U.S. Marine Corps and the U.S. Army might be spread thin. So how do their concepts then feed how they might operate in this area? Of course, the geographic combatant commands will dictate where forces will go and what they want them to do. But the forces are going to be trained, right, by the services, and the concepts that are going to influence their thinking then is going to be applied in these areas. So the Marine Corps might find itself fighting to get to or through, say, the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap to get to Scandinavia. And that, I think, poses some real issues because the Marine Corps is setting itself up, first of all, not to be the forcible entry force in the sense that the U.S. Army might be on a grander front, right? It's maneuver force. It's going to come in on a flank. But if the Russians were able to push their bastion defense out the way they would want to, the Marine Corps would need to assist the Navy to find a way in. So that's kind of where my research and my line of questioning has been going. I think that this is a problem that the Marine Corps knows about, but with the focus on the Indo-Pacific, and that's not to say that, say, the U.S. Marines are not operating and or exercising in Norway or around Norway and on NATO's northern flank. I think it's important to note that there's quite a lot that's been going on, especially since Trident Juncture in 2018. But a lot of the assumptions, I think, that feed into how we conduct those exercises are that we've made it, right? So we've made it in. And therefore, now how do we operate that we're here? So I guess with the assumption that the Norwegians have been able to hold off, or, in a grander sense, the Scandinavian countries have been able to hold the Russians at bay. And so now what? I think there's a greater question of, with our allies, force structures, with the capabilities that they have, again, with the strategic weaponry that Russia has that I think we haven't seen come into play in Ukraine, still being a concern with those submarines on the Kola Peninsula, say, spreading out. Yes, we might be able to track a whole bunch of those, but depending on where they go, maybe not necessarily. So that Russian bastion defense, right, really kind of spreading out. How far does it get? And therefore, what do we need to get in? There are fewer islands and so on and so forth. I mean, there's tons of islands on the coast of Norway, but between, say, Greenland and Norway, not as much. So I don't have any clear answers on this. I'm really engaging with the concepts and asking these questions as a skeptic, of not readily hitting the I believe button, which I think is one of the things we need and one of the things that we can do as academics. And I certainly look forward to kind of having these discussions with people, which we have been having here at the Marine Corps University, which has been great. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lon. And I think it's something to note. The United States, as you said, is still focused, or at least the Marines are still focused on Indo-Pacific, and clearly, I think one thing that we'll see in the next security strategy, next defense strategy, when they come out, how they view basically what has happened with Russia, and how basically the eyes must still be focused on China. But Russia still has a bastion defense. It still has a lot of presence in the North Atlantic, in the Arctic region. It's not going to go away, which I think echoes the comments made earlier by Dr. Odgaard. So thank you, Lon. So just one quick announcement. We're also adding an additional speaker to the list, that will be Lieutenant Colonel Marius Kristiansen. But for now, let us go to our next speaker, and this is Commander Steinar Torset of Norwegian Defence Command and Staff College. Commander Torset, please go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks for giving us this opportunity to share our thoughts on NATO's and allied partners' ability to conduct operations in the Arctic or the High North. As Liselotte said, NATO should enable themselves to still operate in the Arctic, and my thoughts will be about how we are actually developing our military capabilities to do exactly that. And I guess I will be talking as one of the practitioners in the room, alongside my academic colleagues. It's already been said, but you know, the National Defense Strategy from 2018 gave clear new directions for the development of the armed forces in the US, including the US Marine Corps. And in the following Commandant's Planning Guidance from 2019, this transformation became very visible. And with the Force Design 2030, the new course and speed for the future Marine Corps were set. In the latest annual update of Force Design 2030, I guess I don't have to remind this audience, but it is repeated that the NDS 2018 redirected the Marine Corps mission focus from countering violent extremists in the Middle East to great power pair level competition with special emphasis on the Indo-Pacific, has been mentioned several times already. And let me also remind the audience of the guidance given by General Berger in his planning guidance, where he clearly stated that we cannot afford to build multiple forces optimized for a specific competency, such as Arctic warfare, urban operations, or desert warfare. We will build one force. And that's the only place in the document the word Arctic is used. In General Berger's Force Design 2030, Arctic as a potential area of operation for the Marine Corps is not mentioned. Guidance is rather focusing on lack of capabilities related to the shift in the primary focus to great power competition and a renewed focus again on the Indo-Pacific region. And you know, this along with a two-pager that came out March this year about an updated national security strategy gives the direction again towards an Indo-Pacific driven development and transformation, which I guess is in many ways understandable. Having said all that, I have to say that, you know, I'm quite impressed with the work done this year by Major General Frank Donovan and what he and his team has done with their Task Force 612. And, you know, the activities aiming to experiment and test concepts in order to contribute to the operationalization of a modernized Marine Corps is nothing but admirable. The reconnaissance, counter-reconnaissance activities, the flexibility, the creativeness they have showed during these efforts are, in my view, good stuff. However, Greece, Turkey, the Baltics, yeah, they are most definitely in Europe, and the Baltics is even in Northern Europe, but it's not the High North. Even though this definition is not accurate, but what is accurate is my claim that the Baltic Sea in June, July does not represent the challenges you will face in a January dark, windy, icy, rainy, and cold Arctic. So when General Donovan stated in one of the podcasts, and I think it was in the broadcast actually, that the areas around Camp Lejeune is the premier littoral training zone with coastal, riverine, estuary, and tough, complex infantry terrain, I have no doubt that he is correct. But when he concludes with the statement that if you can fight and win there, especially at night, you can fight and win anywhere. Well, General, I dare to disagree about that statement. And I am convinced that if you are not prepared for what the Arctic throws at you when it comes to the operating environment, you are in danger of not being able to survive for very long. A British Royal Marine mountain leader expressed it very clearly that if you survive in the Arctic, you can survive anywhere, also in the desert and in the jungle. It's not the other way around. And it was brought up, Trident Juncture, by Lon here. And I have to, you know, remind the audience again that, you know, the Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group was heading for Trident Juncture in 2018. And two out of the three ships, the Gunston Hall and New York, had actually to abort their transit to the exercise. They never made it. And this was explained with bad weather, heavy seas. Gunston Hall took some severe damage to the well deck and some of the landing crafts inside. In addition, it was reported that many on board were seasick. Well, my take, I guess, at the end of the day, is that you need to be equipped for and trained for operations in the challenging areas like the Arctic. And I would really like to see a new ARG-MU make a new effort to get across and up to the Arctic in order to experience the winter conditions and take their experimentation in developing a new Marine Corps also into the Arctic. That's the only way to make sure that this new force also will be able to operate in that part of the theater. Thank you.
Thank you, Commander Torset. And I think one thing that we can think about for just taking that idea, the Arctic is a very challenging operating environment. We're about to see continuous cold weather combat across Ukraine right now, which is not the Arctic, but it is cold weather. And we will see how basically Ukraine and Russia fare. Russia had lost soldiers to frostbite in the first month of this conflict. So we can, again, Eastern Ukraine is not the Arctic, but perhaps we can take some lessons from what the next 6 months of combat look like. So thank you very much for that. And now to our very favorite Scandinavian guest at Krulak Center. Please go ahead, Dr. Wegge, please. Okay.
So again, thank you, Krulak Center, for giving us this opportunity to be here. Our research team, we have a great time and really appreciate it. So I'll also just make a few comments on what has been said here. I think it can't be underestimated how important it is to understand the geographical challenges, the distances, the logistical hardships of operating in the Arctic. And I think Steinar made it very clear that one cannot necessarily think it's just to, move everything up north and think it works as it does elsewhere. So I also think the Ukraine war has made the Arctic perhaps not so center stage, but still maybe giving the Russian strategic nuclear capability even a greater role. And the Arctic will remain as a very crucial regional theater for NATO, but also Russia and the global sort of like great power competition. And the new thing is that we have had a situation with stability and low tension, and no one really knows where it's going. And of course, that's very much depending on the development on the ground in Ukraine and across the Atlantic, Russia-Western relationship generally. So this is a new situation where also the Arctic is facing a new severe uncertainty, I would say. But NATO has great advantages, great strengths. We have a club of a lot of very sophisticated, advanced democracies that have unique strength, now being welcoming Finland and Sweden additionally, we'll hope. So there's a lot of good things with NATO that can be exploited and further developed. But I think there's a need to develop skills individually, unit level, and collectively within the alliance. We've talked about the difficulties with command and control, communication, and in the Arctic it's even harder. There might be unique features with satellite coverage that are not so easy to utilize as elsewhere, etc. And I think the answer is to be more present and operate more and have more, for example, Marines actually being in the Arctic for periods and experiencing this themselves and sort of like developing the collective skills that's needed. And I think our book project will knit together many of these things. And Lon also talked a little bit about how we think the Scandinavian countries perhaps could, be a part of the MDO in the fashion of being so well integrated and trained that they can be sort of like a stand-in force for the joint forces, working very tightly with the United States and other key partners. So this is something we want to explore more in the book project.
Thank you, Dr. Wegge. And our next speaker and our final speaker is Lieutenant Colonel Marius Kristiansen from Norwegian Armed Forces, who also comes with a special operations background. So, Lieutenant Colonel, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me on this great event, and thank you for letting me participate in the book project also to Professor Wegge. As you mentioned, I come in here with the special operations background, and that's my my focus on both the workshop and my opening remarks here. We've tried to look at this with the whole conflict spectrum in our mind. But before something happens, and left of the bang is where special operations is supposed to be making an effort and making a difference, at least how we see it in the Arctic. Because the Arctic region has definitely captured the public's attention the last years, but its strategic importance in global power competition seems less understood, or at least not focused on in the military. So the Arctic may be geographically peripheral, but for a number of reasons, competitively quite essential. So in short, the Arctic represents NATO's northern flank. And although NATO has substantial presence on the borders of the Arctic, a presence that will be reinforced when Sweden and Finland joins the alliance, of course, the Arctic problem complex remains a challenge. And our competitors, they have already stated their objectives. They have started their positioning, and they have initiated their first moves in the Arctic. And that makes the Arctic an active competitive arena today. So as coming from the military and working with the US military, we are always concerned about the concept of winning. And winning the Arctic competition will be challenging. And as an active arena of global power competition, it will require application of the whole spectrum of tools of national power, dime, if you will, or the entire dime fill, as pointed to by Professor Odgaard when she talked about ISR. The last fill there is going to be important. The sensitivity of the global power competition context, the proximity to our competitors' vital interests and source of strength, as well as direct influence on the security and freedom movement for the alliance, all set in the extremely challenging environment of the Arctic, calls for firmness and precision in action. And this description points to SOF as one of the primary tools for utilization of military means in the Arctic. But we are facing a challenge, and several of the other speakers have pointed to that already. We are mentally bound by a generation of CT and coin focus in the global war on terror. So the cognitive models necessary to appreciate the GPC context, they are actually absent. And the potential for SOF as a strategic enabler in the Arctic is, as we see it, is massive. But it will require a deep understanding of the operating environment and focus on the roles that actually matter. And that's the key point there, the roles that actually matter. We are not able to fake it until we make it in the Arctic. That's not just going to happen. So it will require working with partners, together with partners, through partners. It will require campaigning and not just a campaign. As of now, the global SOF network that has been working elegantly and really effectively in the global war on terror does not have the unity of effort and the unity in strategy as earlier. So to coordinate a strategy for these, for a Arctic partnership, that will be crucial. And we are now looking into options from our research side of the house, and as researchers and military officers, to see if potentially NSHQ can be a relevant body in order to generate that unity of strategy, or if, for example, entities like US SOCOM, J3I could be that body. So with that concludes my initial comments.
Okay, thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Kristiansen. We're coming up towards the end of the time allotted to us, but to try and put all this together, it's quite clear that the Arctic is going to be a central zone of contestation for the rest of this century. Between whatever happens to Russia, climate change, and in fact the changes that are brought on by both of those things, there is going to be a lot more international attention for a number of economic, social, political, and security reasons in this larger area. And I am very glad that all of you are working on this very carefully, and that also the Krulak Center is taking steps in order to make, as well as, Command and Staff College, Dr. Strauss, as well as Marine Corps universities taking steps to understand what are U.S. equities and what can the U.S. do to echo what Lieutenant Colonel Kristiansen just said, which is not just a campaign, but a series of campaigning in order to understand how stability and peace can be brought to the larger Arctic zone. So this is going to be an issue that will, in effect, occupy us for the rest of our professional lives. And it's very exciting in a certain sense, but also very challenging. So without further ado, I would like to thank our speakers, Dr. Odgaard, Dr. Bones, Dr. Strauss, Dr. Wegge, Commander Torset, and Lieutenant Colonel Kristiansen for their thoughts and for their participation. And let me turn it now back to Major Ian Brown of the Krulak Center.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Weber. And just to reiterate, on behalf of the Krulak Center, definite thanks to everyone who participated in the discussion today, as well as Dr. Wegge for making all these people available to us. Definitely unique opportunity. And we hope to have more of these here in the future, thanks to the liaison we have with our through Dr. Wegge and the Norwegian Defence University College. To our audience, thanks for listening to this today. And I'll make another plug for something we've been adding to our episodes, and as in an effort to constantly improve what we're doing here at the Krulak Center, is in the show notes there's going to be a quick survey. And in addition to giving us a thumbs up on YouTube or 5-star ratings on our podcast channels, if you can take a couple minutes to go through the survey, it really helps us figure out what content you find useful and where we can do some improvements or offer things of potential interest that we've not previously offered. So link will be in the show notes. It's a simple Google form, and we appreciate any responses and time you'd like to put into that. So again, thank you for joining us for this Brucecast, and we'll see you for the next one very soon.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.